The silence in that conference room was deafening. 23 pairs of eyes stared at me as my fingers moved across the keyboard with the precision of a surgeon, each keystroke echoing like thunder in the suddenly hushed space. Just minutes before, they had been laughing cruel, dismissive laughter that cut deeper than any blade ever could. Mark Henderson's voice still rang in my ears. Maybe we should let someone from this century handle the real work, Angela. This century, as if my 52 years on this earth, 30 of them dedicated to mastering code that most of these kids couldn't even comprehend, somehow made me obsolete. As if the gray threading through my natural curls was a countdown timer on my relevance. As if being a black woman over 50 in tech wasn't already like swimming upstream in a river of concrete. But here I was, watching their smug expressions melt away as lines of code cascaded down my screen. Clean, elegant, powerful. The system that had stumped their entire team for 3 days was bending to my will in real time. Every function call was deliberate, every algorithm a testament to decades of experience they couldn't buy, couldn't fake, couldn't diminish with their snide comments about my generation. I could feel Tanya's eyes on me from across the table, the only person in this room who had ever looked at me with something other than thinly veiled contempt. At 29, she reminded me of myself 3 decades ago, brilliant, ambitious, and learning the hard way that excellence wasn't always enough when you looked like us. The debugging output flashed green. Problem solved. The multi-million-dollar client crisis they'd been panicking about for 72 hours, fixed in 11 minutes by the woman they'd just suggested was too old to understand modern technology. I leaned back in my chair, removed my thick-rimmed glasses, and cleaned them, slowly, a gesture I'd perfected over years of letting moments like this breathe. The room remained frozen in stunned silence. Mark's face had gone pale, his usual swagger evaporating like morning mist in the Chicago sun. The server architecture needed a complete rewrite of the authentication protocol, I said quietly, my voice cutting through the silence like silk through steel. The error wasn't in the front-end logic you've all been chasing. It was in the core validation system, something that required understanding how these systems were originally built. Back when I was supposedly too young to know what I was doing, I stood up, smoothing down my emerald blazer, the color of triumph, the color of life persisting despite every attempt to crush it. Around the table, 23 people were grappling with a truth that, uncomfortable but undeniable, the woman they'd underestimated, dismissed, and mocked, had just saved their careers. This wasn't just about code. This was about every black woman who'd ever been told she didn't belong, every veteran who'd been cast aside for younger models, every person who'd been made to feel invisible in spaces they'd helped build. This moment was decades in the making, and finally it was mine. Before we dive deeper into Angela's story, I'd love to know, what country and state are you watching from? Drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're following Angela's journey. Your support means everything. My name is Angela Robinson, and I carry the weight of my ancestors in every line of code I write. Every morning, I wake up in my Hyde Park apartment, make my coffee in the same ceramic mug my grandmother used to drink from, and look out at the Chicago skyline while mentally preparing for another day of proving my worth. It's exhausting, this constant need to be twice as good to get half the recognition, but it's been my reality for so long that I've learned to transform that pressure into fuel. The mirror in my bathroom reflects a woman who has survived. My dark skin shows the lines that come from years of concentrated focus, of squinting at screens when the technology was harder to read, when the fonts were smaller and the monitors cast that sickly green glow that marked the early days of my career. My hair, now more silver than black, is pulled back in a neat bun that speaks to my nonsense approach to life. These thick glasses aren't a fashion statement, they're tools. Just like everything else I've accumulated over 30 years in an industry that keeps trying to convince me I don't belong. People see a middle-aged black woman in tech and make assumptions. They assume I'm in HR, or maybe accounting. They assume I'm someone's assistant, there to take notes while the real developers solve problems. They never assume I'm the one who designed the system they're struggling to understand, that I wrote the original code they're now calling legacy, as if the foundation of their entire operation is somehow lesser, because it has history, because it has my fingerprints on it. But I know who I am. I'm the daughter of James and Ruby Robinson, school teachers from Montgomery, Alabama, who saved every penny to send their little girl to college. I'm the granddaughter of William Robinson, who taught himself to read in secret during Jim Crow and went on to become one of the first black-owned bookstore owners in the South. I carried their dreams in my DNA, their resilience in my code. When I started at Henderson Tech Solutions 18 months ago, I thought things might be different. The company marketed itself as progressive, diverse, innovative. Their website featured smiling faces of all colors and ages, promising an inclusive environment where experience was valued. The reality, as I discovered on my first day, was far more subtle in its discrimination. Mark Henderson, the founder's son and my direct supervisor, greeted me with the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. He gave me a tour of the office, pointing out the game room, the craft beer on tap, the standing desks that could apparently revolutionize my productivity. Everything about the space screamed young and hip: exposed brick, industrial lighting, motivational posters with phrases like "move fast and break things and code is poetry." "We're really excited to have someone with your background on the team," he said, and I knew immediately what he meant. Not my technical background, which was more extensive than anyone else in the building. He meant my demographic background. I was their diversity hire, their checkbox, their proof that they were inclusive. My cubicle was positioned in the back corner, away from the collaborative spaces where the core team worked. Within a week, I noticed the pattern. The important meetings happened without me. Decisions were made in casual conversations I wasn't part of, and my suggestions in group settings were consistently overlooked until a younger, whiter colleague repeated them and received credit. I tried to tell myself it wasn't about race, that it wasn't about age. Maybe I just needed to prove myself, show them what I could do. I volunteered for the hardest projects, stayed late to perfect code that was already excellent, went above and beyond in every possible way, but the pattern remained unchanged. My contributions were minimized, my expertise questioned, my presence treated as an unfortunate necessity rather than a valuable asset. The breaking point came. During a client presentation 3 weeks ago, I had spent days preparing a comprehensive analysis of our system's vulnerabilities and proposed solutions. The client, a major financial services company, was facing security issues that could have cost them millions. My report was thorough, technically sound, and exactly what they needed. But when presentation day arrived, Mark decided that Jake Morrison, a 26-year-old developer with half my experience, should present my findings. "Jake's got a better rapport with the client demographic," Mark explained when I questioned the decision privately. "Besides, Angela, your presentation style is a bit formal. We need someone who can speak their language." I watched Jake stumble through my analysis, mispronouncing technical terms I'd been using since before he was born, failing to answer basic questions about the implementation details. The client looked confused, then concerned, then openly skeptical. When they started asking for clarification on points that Jake couldn't address, I found myself having to jump in from the back of the room, explaining the concepts he couldn't grasp. "Who prepared this analysis?" The client finally asked directly. "Angela did," Tanya said quietly from her seat near the window. She was the only one who ever acknowledged my contributions, the only person in that room who seemed to see me as something other than invisible. The client turned to me with renewed interest, and suddenly the meeting transformed. They peppered me with technical questions that I answered with the kind of depth and confidence that only comes from real experience. They wanted to discuss implementation timelines, security protocols, integration strategies, all areas where my expertise was undeniable. By the end of the meeting, they specifically requested that I lead the project implementation. Mark tried to maintain his composure, but I could see the frustration in his eyes. His golden boy had been exposed as unprepared, and the client had made it clear they wanted the expertise, not the presentation. That night, I called my brother Charles from my apartment balcony, looking out over the lights of Chicago. The city sprawled before me like a circuit board, each light a connection in the vast network of human ambition and struggle. "They don't see me, Charles," I told him, my voice barely above a whisper. 30 years I've been doing this, and they still look at me like I'm playing dress-up in grown folks' clothes. "Angela," he said in that deep, steady voice that had been my anchor since childhood, "they don't see you because they can't afford to. If they really saw you, saw how brilliant you are, how much you know, how much you've contributed, they'd have to confront everything they believe about who belongs in their world. You're not just a threat to their competence. You're a threat to their entire worldview." His words stayed with me as I prepared for another day at the office. Another day of being overlooked, underestimated, and undervalued. But something was shifting inside me. A resolve that had been building for months, finally crystallizing into something harder, sharper. I was done being invisible. I was done accepting the crumbs from tables I had helped build. It was time to remind everyone exactly who Angela Robinson was, and what happened when you pushed a woman like me too far. The morning of what would become known as the incident started like any other Tuesday at Henderson Tech Solutions. I arrived at 7:30 a.m., my usual half hour before anyone else, savoring the quiet moments when the office belonged just to me. The industrial lighting hummed softly overhead, casting long shadows across the open workspace that would soon fill with the cacophony of youth trying to change the world, or at least make enough money to afford the overpriced coffee from the artisanal shop downstairs. I settled into my corner workstation, the one positioned strategically away from the collaborative zones where the real work supposedly happened. My desk was meticulously organized, monitors positioned at the exact right height to prevent neck strain after decades of coding. A small, succulent plant Tanya had given me as a birthday gift, one of only 3 people in the office who knew when my birthday was, and a framed photo of my parents from their retirement party at the school where they'd taught for 35 years combined. The photo always centered me, Daddy in his best suit, the one he wore to church every Sunday and special occasions, Mama in her royal blue dress, the one she'd sewn herself because she could never find anything appropriate for a woman of substance in the stores. Behind them, dozens of former students, now adults with children of their own, had come to honor the teachers who had shaped their lives. That's legacy, I always thought when I looked at that picture. That's what it means to build something lasting. My morning ritual included reviewing the overnight error logs, checking system performance metrics, and scanning through the code commits from the previous day. It was detective work, really finding the stories that data told, understanding the patterns that revealed both problems and opportunities. This particular morning, I noticed something troubling in the authentication system. The error rates had been climbing steadily over the past week, subtle enough that the monitoring systems hadn't triggered any alerts, but significant enough to suggest a deeper issue brewing beneath the surface. I pulled up the relevant code modules, tracing through the authentication flow with the methodical precision that had earned me recognition at my previous companies. The problem wasn't obvious, it never was, with the really dangerous issues. This was the kind of bug that could remain dormant for weeks or months, then catastrophically fail at the worst possible moment, when system load was high and client confidence was on the line. By 8 a.m., the office began to fill with my colleagues. Jake Morrison arrived first among the developers, his skateboard tucked under his arm, and his laptop bag slung across his shoulder like a badge of tech bro authenticity. He nodded in my general direction, without making eye contact, his usual greeting that acknowledged my existence without requiring him to engage with my humanity. "Morning, Angela," Tanya said as she passed my workstation, and I caught the hint of genuine warmth in her voice. She was carrying 2 coffee cups, both from the expensive place downstairs. "Brought you your usual oat milk cappuccino with an extra shot." "You didn't have to do that," I said, accepting the cup gratefully. Tanya was the only person in the office who had ever bothered to learn how I took my coffee, the only one who saw these small gestures as important, rather than trivial. "I know I didn't have to," she replied with a smile that reminded me why I'd taken her under my wing. "I wanted to. Plus, I had a feeling we might need the extra caffeine today." Mark scheduled an emergency client review for this afternoon. The emergency client review that explained the tension I'd been sensing in the office atmosphere. Henderson Tech had been working on a project for Morrison Financial, ironically, no relation to Jake, for 6 months. It was our biggest contract, worth nearly $2 million. And the client had been growing increasingly frustrated with delays and technical issues. "Did he say what the emergency was about?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. The authentication system issues I'd been tracking were probably affecting the client's user experience, creating login failures and security concerns that would have their IT department in full panic mode. "Something about user authentication failures," Tanya confirmed. "The client is threatening to pull the contract if we can't resolve it by end of week." I sipped my cappuccino and considered my options. I could approach Mark directly with my analysis, but past experience suggested he'd either dismiss my findings or credit them to someone else. I could document everything thoroughly and wait for the afternoon meeting. positioning myself to contribute when the discussion inevitably reached technical details they couldn't handle. Or I could continue my investigation quietly, gathering enough evidence to make my case undeniable when the moment arrived. The morning progressed with the usual rhythm of startup energy and corporate dysfunction. The younger developers clustered around the central workspace, their conversations a mix of technical jargon and pop culture references that seemed designed to establish in-group status as much as solve problems. I listened with half an ear while diving deeper into the authentication system, mapping the connections between different components and identifying the specific conditions that were triggering failures. Around 10:30, Mark emerged from his corner office for his daily walk through a ritual that involved checking in with his favored team members while conspicuously avoiding meaningful interaction with others. He spent 20 minutes at Jake's workstation, discussing weekend plans and some new JavaScript framework they'd both read about. He chatted with Sarah Chen about her upcoming vacation to Thailand, offering recommendations from his own recent trip. He even stopped to admire the new standing desk that Marcus Williams had requested and received within 48 hours. When he passed my workstation, he paused just long enough to glance at my monitors without genuine interest. "Everything going okay back here, Ange?" The phrase "back here" struck me like a physical blow, as if my corner of the office was somehow separate from the real workspace, a remote outpost where the less essential work happened, as if 30 years of experience in software development made me peripheral to the core mission of the company. "Actually, Mark, I've been analyzing the authentication system issues," I began, turning to face him directly. "I think I've identified the root cause of the problems Morrison Financial has been experiencing thus." "Great," he said with the kind of dismissive enthusiasm reserved for children who've drawn pictures they want adults to admire. "Why don't you document your findings, and we'll review them in the team meeting later?" "I think this might be more urgent than Angela," he interrupted, his voice taking on a slightly patronizing tone. "I appreciate your initiative, but we've got our best people working on this issue. Jake's been leading the authentication module development, and he knows that code better than anyone." I felt the familiar heat rising in my chest, the combination of frustration and indignation that had become my constant companion in this job. "Mark, I've been working with authentication systems since before Jake graduated high school. I think my experience might be valuable here." Mark's expression shifted subtly, his professional mask slipping just enough to reveal the irritation underneath. "Look, I know you have experience, but this is a modern JavaScript application with microservices architecture. It's probably quite different from the systems you've worked on at your previous companies." The condescension in his voice was unmistakable now. Modern JavaScript, as if the programming languages I'd been mastering for decades had somehow evolved beyond my comprehension in the 18 months I'd been at this job. As if the fundamental principles of authentication, security, and system design that I'd been applying successfully for 30 years had become obsolete in the time it took him to inherit his father's company. "I understand modern architectures," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the storm building inside me. "I helped design several of the systems that your modern frameworks are based on." "Right," Mark said, his attention already drifting toward Jake's workstation, where a small crowd had gathered around some new code demonstration. "Well, let's see what the team comes up with in the review meeting. I'm sure we'll get it sorted out." He walked away before I could respond, leaving me staring at his retreating figure with a mixture of disbelief and cold determination. This wasn't just about being overlooked anymore. This was about being actively marginalized, having my expertise questioned not based on my performance, but on assumptions about my age, my relevance, my ability to understand the work I'd been doing longer than most of my colleagues had been alive. I returned to my analysis with renewed focus, diving deeper into the code than I had originally planned. If Mark wanted to see what his best people could accomplish, I was more than willing to let this play out, but I would be ready when their efforts inevitably fell short, armed with solutions they couldn't ignore and evidence they couldn't dismiss. The authentication system was more broken than I'd initially realized, but it was also more fixable. The problems stemmed from fundamental architectural decisions that showed a lack of understanding about how security protocols actually worked in high-load environments. It was the kind of mistake that bright, young developers often made when they prioritized speed and innovation over stability and security. As I worked, I became aware of the growing tension in the office around me. Whispered conversations, urgent phone calls, the body language of people trying to solve a problem they didn't fully understand. The Morrison financial crisis was real, and it was getting worse by the hour. Perfect. Let them struggle with their modern solutions to ancient problems. When the afternoon meeting arrived and their approaches failed, I would be ready to demonstrate what 3 decades of experience actually meant. The storm was gathering, and I intended to be the eye of it. At 2 p.m. sharp, we assembled in the main conference room, a glass-walled space at the center of the office that Mark had designed to showcase his team's collaborative spirit to visitors and clients. The afternoon Chicago sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long rectangles of light across the polished concrete floor and making the room feel like a fishbowl on display. I chose a seat toward the back of the room, positioning myself where I could observe everyone's reactions while maintaining clear sight lines to the projection screen where our technical crisis would be dissected. It was a strategic choice born from years of meetings, where I'd learned to read the room as carefully as I read code, watching for the tells that revealed who really understood the problems being discussed and who was merely performing understanding. Mark entered with his usual swagger, tablet in hand and confidence radiating from every gesture. He wore his favorite navy blazer over dark jeans, the uniform of a tech executive who wanted to appear both professional and approachably modern. Behind him came Jake, carrying a laptop and wearing the expression of someone who'd been tasked with solving a problem he hoped he understood better than he actually did. "All right, team," Mark began, settling into his chair at the head of the table. "We've got a situation with Morrison Financial that needs immediate resolution. They're experiencing significant authentication failures. User complaints are piling up, and their CTO called this morning threatening to terminate the contract if we can't provide a solution by Friday." A murmur of concern rippled through the room. Morrison Financial wasn't just our biggest client, they were our showcase account. The one Mark used in sales presentations to demonstrate our capabilities to potential customers. Losing them wouldn't just be a financial blow, it would be a reputation destroyer in a market where word of mouth traveled fast and unforgiving. "Jake's been leading our investigation," Mark continued, gesturing toward his favorite developer. "Jake, want to walk us through what you've found?" Jake stood and moved to the front of the room with the kind of confidence that came from never having had his competence seriously questioned. He connected his laptop to the projection system and pulled up a series of code snippets and error logs that I recognized from my own analysis. "So, the authentication failures seem to be clustered around peak usage times," Jake began, clicking through slides that showed error rate graphs and user activity patterns. "We're seeing about a 12% failure rate during high load periods, which drops to around 3% during off-peak hours." I leaned forward slightly, studying his analysis. He was correct about the correlation between load and failure rates, but he was missing the underlying causation. The timing wasn't coincidental, it was symptomatic of a deeper architectural problem that his surface-level investigation hadn't uncovered. "My initial assessment," Jake continued, "is that we're dealing with a database connection pooling issue. When we hit high concurrent user loads, the connection pool gets exhausted and authentication requests start timing out." Several people around the table nodded as if this explanation made perfect sense. It was a reasonable theory for someone with limited experience in large-scale system design, the kind of obvious culprit that junior developers often blamed when they encountered performance issues they didn't fully understand. But I knew he was wrong. I'd spent the morning tracing through the actual authentication flow, following the code paths that handled user credentials and session management. The connection pooling was inadequate for the load patterns we were experiencing, properly configured for failover and recovery. The real problem was in the token validation logic, a subtle race condition that only manifested when multiple authentication requests for the same user arrived within a specific time window. "So my recommendation," Jake continued, "is that we increase the database connection pool size and implement some additional catching around the user lookup queries. That should reduce the load on the database and eliminate most of these timeout issues." Mark smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose faith in his chosen expert had been validated. "Sounds like a solid plan. How long do you think implementation will take?" "I can have the connection pool changes deployed by tomorrow morning," Jake replied. "The catching implementation might take until Thursday, but we should see significant improvement even with just the first fix." felt the familiar tightness in my chest that came from watching technical discussions proceed down entirely wrong paths with absolute confidence. In my 3 decades of experience, I'd seen this pattern countless times. Smart people making reasonable-sounding mistakes because they approached complex problems with insufficient context and excessive certainty. "Anyone have questions or concerns about Jake's analysis?" Mark asked, scanning the room with the perfunctory attention of someone going through the motions of soliciting input without genuinely wanting it. I raised my hand slightly, the gesture automatic, despite my internal debate about whether to speak up. Around the table, several pairs of eyes turned toward me with expressions ranging from polite attention to barely concealed irritation. In the 18 months I'd worked at Henderson Tech, I'd learned that my contributions to technical discussions were generally received as interruptions rather than insights. "Yes, Angela." Mark's tone was neutral, but I caught the subtle edge that suggested he was already preparing to move past whatever concern I might raise. "I've been analyzing the same authentication failures," I said, keeping my voice steady and professional. "I don't think we're dealing with a database connection issue." Jake's expression shifted subtly, his confidence flickering for just a moment before reasserting itself. "What makes you think that?" "I traced through the actual authentication flow this morning," I replied, pulling out my own notes. "The connection pool metrics don't support your theory. We're not seeing the connection exhaustion patterns you'd expect if that were the root cause." "What patterns are you seeing?" asked Tanya from her seat near the window. She was the only person in the room, leaning forward with genuine interest. Treating my input as potentially valuable rather than an unwelcome delay, I opened my notebook and referenced the detailed analysis I'd compiled. "The failures are actually concentrated in the token validation sub-process. Specifically when we're processing renewal requests for active sessions, there's a race condition in the validation logic that creates brief windows where legitimate authentication requests get rejected." The room fell silent for a moment as people processed this information. I could see Jake's face cycling through confusion, skepticism, and something that might have been concern as he mentally reviewed his own analysis. "That," single quotes, Jake paused, then continued with renewed confidence, "That's an interesting theory, Angela, but I've reviewed the token validation code extensively. It's pretty straightforward logic, and I don't see how a race condition could occur in that context. The race condition occurs when 2 authentication requests for the same user arrive within approximately 50 milliseconds of each other," I explained, referring to my notes. "The first request updates the user's session timestamp in the database, but the second request begins validation using the pre-update, which causes the token validation to fail even though both requests are legitimate." Mark's expression had shifted from polite attention to visible impatience. "Angela, I appreciate your thoroughness, but Jake has been working on this system for months. I think his assessment of the database connection issue is probably more accurate." The dismissal hit me like a physical blow, all the more painful for its casual delivery. Not just my analysis being questioned, but my entire capability being diminished in favor of someone whose primary qualifications seemed to be that Mark found him more relatable than a 52-year-old black woman with decades of relevant experience. "I understand Jake has been working on the system," I replied, my voice remaining calm despite the frustration building inside me. "But I've been working on authentication systems since before this company existed. I know what race conditions look like, and I know how to fix them." "Right," Mark said with a patronizing smile that made my skin crawl. "But this is a modern Node.js application, using JWT tokens and microservices architecture. It's probably quite different from the authentication systems you worked with in your previous roles." The condescension in his voice was no longer subtle. Modern Node.js JWT tokens, as if the fundamental principles of concurrent programming and token validation had somehow evolved beyond my comprehension in the past few years. As if the computer science concepts I'd been applying successfully for 3 decades had become obsolete. In the time it took this company to adopt frameworks that were built on foundations I'd helped lay, authentication is authentication, I said quietly. The frameworks change, but the core concepts remain the same. Race conditions in concurrent systems have been a known issue since the 1960s. "I'm sure they have," Mark replied with the kind of smile adults use when humoring children who think they understand grown-up conversations. "But I think we should focus on practical solutions that can be implemented quickly. Jake's connection pool optimization is straightforward, well understood, and can be deployed immediately." Around the table, I saw several people nodding in agreement, not because they understood the technical details. Most of them were project managers and designers who wouldn't recognize a race condition if it crashed their systems, but because Mark's confidence was infectious, and supporting his chosen expert was the safest political position. Jake had regained his composure and was looking at me with something approaching pity. Angela, I really do appreciate you taking the time to review this. But I've run extensive tests on the token validation logic. It's working exactly as designed. Then your design is flawed. I said, the words escaping before I could stop them. The room fell completely silent. Even the ambient noise from the office outside seemed to pause as everyone processed what I'd just said. Jake's face flushed red, Mark's expression hardened, and I realized I'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Excuse me. Mark's voice was dangerously quiet. I met his gaze steadily, knowing there was no backing down now. I said the design is flawed. The token validation logic has a race condition that becomes visible under load. Jake's connection pool optimization won't fix it because connection pooling isn't the problem, Angela, Mark said, his voice taking on the tone he might use with a subordinate who'd forgotten their place. I think you need to remember that Jake is the lead developer on this project. He understands this codebase better than anyone in this room. No, I said quietly, he doesn't. The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Around the table, people shifted uncomfortably, sensing that something significant was happening but not entirely sure what it was or how they should respond. Mark leaned back in his chair, studying me with the kind of cold calculation that suggested he was deciding exactly how to handle this insubordination. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd made a decision about my future at the company. Well then, Angela, he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, maybe it's time we let you prove that theory. The challenge hung in the air like electricity before a storm. Around the conference table, 23 people sat in stunned silence, their eyes moving between Mark and me as if watching a tennis match where the stakes were higher than anyone had expected. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, steady but strong, like the rhythm of a drum calling warriors to battle. Mark's smile was razor-sharp now, the expression of a man who believed he was about to watch someone destroy their own career. Since you seem so confident that Jake's analysis is wrong, Angela, why don't you show us your solution? Right now, in front of everyone. The trap was obvious. He was counting on me to stumble, to reveal that my confidence was built on theoretical knowledge rather than practical understanding. He expected me to make excuses, to backpedal, to reveal myself as the outdated dinosaur he believed me to be. This was his moment to definitively establish the hierarchy he'd been enforcing through subtle dismissals and casual condescension. But Mark Henderson didn't know who he was dealing with. He saw a middle-aged black woman who'd somehow managed to talk her way into a position above her capabilities. He didn't see the daughter of teachers who'd learned to turn pressure into diamonds. He didn't see the granddaughter of a man who'd taught himself to read in secret and built a business from nothing. He didn't see the product of Bronzeville, where excellence wasn't just expected, it was required for survival. I'll need access to the production logs and the authentication service code, I said calmly, standing up from my chair with the deliberate grace I'd learned from watching my grandmother prepare for church every Sunday. And I'll need everyone to stay quiet so I can concentrate. Tanya immediately moved to connect her laptop to the projection system, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she pulled up the necessary development tools. She was the only person in the room who looked excited rather than anxious, her eyes bright with anticipation of watching a master at work. Angela, you can't just, Jake began, but Mark raised a hand to silence him. No, let her try, Mark said, leaning back in his chair with the satisfied expression of someone about to watch a public execution. I'm curious to see what 3 decades of experience looks like when it meets modern technology. The condescension in his voice was like fuel poured on a fire that had been burning inside me for months. Every dismissive comment, every overlooked contribution, every time I'd been made to feel invisible or irrelevant, all of it crystallized into a cold, focused determination that settled over me like armor. I walked to the front of the room and took control of the projection system, my fingers finding the keyboard with the muscle memory of 30 years spent translating thoughts into code. The familiar feel of keys beneath my fingertips was grounding, connecting me to the thousands of hours I'd spent solving problems that other people couldn't even properly identify. First, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent room. Let me show you what Jake missed in his analysis. I pulled up the authentication service logs, filtering them to show only the failure patterns from the past week. The data appeared on the screen, in neat columns of timestamps, error codes, and user identifiers, raw information that told a story if you knew how to read it. Jake, you said the failures were clustered around peak usage times, correct? I asked, without turning round, my attention focused on the data flowing across the screen. Yes, Jake replied, his voice tight with uncertainty. And your theory was that database connection pool exhaustion was causing authentication timeouts during high load periods. That's right. I pulled up a second window showing the database connection metrics for the same time periods. The graphs clearly showed connection pool utilization, query response times, and error rates, all the metrics that would support Jake's theory if it were correct. If connection pool exhaustion were the problem, I said, highlighting specific data points, we would see correlation between connection pool saturation and authentication failures. But look at this. I circled a section of the graph where authentication failures spiked while connection pool utilization remained well below capacity. A murmur went through the room as people began to see the disconnect between Jake's theory and the actual data. I could feel the energy shifting, skepticism giving way to curiosity as the evidence contradicted the confident explanation they'd been given. This failure spike occurred at 2:17 a.m. on Sunday, I continued, when system load was at its lowest point of the week. If we were dealing with load-related connection issues, this pattern would be impossible. Jake's face had gone pale as he stared at the data on the screen. I could see him mentally reviewing his analysis, realizing that he'd focused on correlation without properly investigating causation. Now, let me show you the real problem, I said, pulling up the authentication service code. My fingers moved across the keyboard with increasing speed and confidence as I navigated through the codebase, following paths that Jake had apparently never explored. The code structure was familiar to me, not because I'd worked on this specific system, but because I understood the underlying patterns that governed how authentication systems were built. Here's the token validation function, I said, highlighting a block of code that controlled how user credentials were verified. And here's where the race condition occurs. I traced through the logic step by step, explaining how concurrent requests for the same user could create a timing window where valid authentication attempts were rejected due to timestamp validation conflicts. When two authentication requests arrive within milliseconds, I explained, highlighting the specific lines of problematic code. The first request updates the user's last_login timestamp in the database, but the second request, which began processing before that update completed, is still using the old timestamp for validation. The system interprets this as a potential replay attack and rejects the authentication. The room was completely silent now, everyone's attention focused on the code displayed on the screen. Even Mark had stopped looking smugly confident and was actually paying attention to my explanation. The reason this correlates with peak usage isn't because of connection pool issues, I continued, but because high traffic periods increase the likelihood of concurrent authentication requests from the same user. Mobile apps, retrying failed connections, users double-clicking login buttons, automated systems with aggressive retry logic, all of these create the conditions where this race condition becomes visible. I could see understanding dawning on several faces around the table. Tanya was nodding enthusiastically. Sarah Chen was taking detailed notes, and even some of the project managers who usually glazed over during technical discussions were following along with obvious interest. "So, how do you fix it?" asked Marcus Williams from his position near the door. This was the moment I'd been building toward, the demonstration that would prove my expertise wasn't just theoretical but practical, actionable, and immediately valuable. I cracked my knuckles, one's a habit from my earliest programming days, and began typing. The solution is to implement proper locking around the timestamp validation logic, I said, my fingers flying across the keyboard as I wrote code in real. We create a brief mutex lock using the user ID as a key, ensuring that concurrent authentication requests for the same user are processed sequentially rather than simultaneously. The code flowed from my fingers like water, each line building on the last with the kind of elegant efficiency that only came from decades of practice. I wasn't just fixing the immediate problem, I was implementing a solution that would prevent similar race conditions throughout the system, while maintaining optimal performance characteristics. This implementation uses Redis for distributed locking, I explained as I worked, which means it will scale across multiple server instances and automatically handle lock expiration. To prevent deadlock conditions, Jake was staring at the screen with a mixture of fascination and something that might have been horror as he watched me refactor his authentication system in real. The code I was writing was cleaner, more efficient, and more robust than the original implementation, and I was doing it from memory, without referring to documentation or Stack Overflow posts. The lock timeout is set to 200 milliseconds, I continued, which is long enough to prevent race conditions but short enough to avoid any noticeable performance impact. And the implementation includes comprehensive error handling to ensure that system failures don't leave locks in place permanently. As I worked, I became aware of the changing atmosphere in the room. The skeptical murmurs had stopped. The casual conversations had ended. Everyone was watching me with the kind of focused attention usually reserved for magic, tricks, or natural disasters events that demanded complete presence because they might never be witnessed again. Within 7 minutes, I had completely rewritten the problematic authentication logic. The new code was displayed on the screen for everyone to see. Clean, well commented, and architecturally sound. It wasn't just a patch or a workaround, it was a fundamental improvement that addressed the root cause while enhancing the overall system design. Now, I said, turning to face the room for the first time since I'd begun coding, let me show you how this fixes the Morrison Financial issue. I pulled up the error logs again, this time running them through a simulation that showed how the authentication requests would be processed under the new system. The failure patterns that had been plaguing the client for weeks simply disappeared, replaced by clean, successful authentication flows. The race condition was causing approximately 12% of authentication attempts to fail during peak usage periods, I explained, pointing to the before and after comparison on the screen. With proper locking in place, that failure rate drops to essentially zero. The silence in the room was different, now not the uncomfortable quiet of people waiting for failure, but the stunned hush of people witnessing something they hadn't expected to see. Jake was staring at his hands, his confidence completely deflated. Mark's expression had transformed from smug anticipation to something approaching shock. How long would it take to implement this solution? Asked Sarah Chen, breaking the silence with a practical question that everyone was thinking but no one had dared to ask. The code is already written, I replied simply. It would take about 30 minutes to deploy to our staging environment for testing, and another hour to push it to production if the tests pass successfully. 30 minutes, Mark's voice cracked slightly on the question. 30 minutes, I confirmed. I could have it deployed and tested before the end of this meeting, if you want me to proceed. The room erupted in a buzz of excited conversation as people began to understand what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a technical solution, it was a complete resolution to the crisis that had been threatening their biggest client relationship, the problem that Jake's team had been struggling with for days, that had prompted emergency meetings and contract-threatening phone calls, had been solved in real time by the woman they'd been treating as an irrelevant afterthought. Bach sat back in his chair, his face cycling through a range of emotions as he processed what had just happened. The golden boy he'd been grooming as the technical leader of the company had been completely outclassed by the person he'd been subtly undermining for months. The modern technology expertise he'd been championing had proved inadequate. When faced with a problem that required deep understanding of fundamental computer science principles, well, he said finally, his voice carefully controlled, That's quite impressive, Angela. But I wasn't done. The fire that had been building inside me for months was finally finding its voice. And there were things that needed to be said, not just about this particular problem, but about the patterns of dismissal and disrespect that had led to this moment. This is what 30 years of experience actually looks like. Mark, I said quietly, my voice carrying clearly through the now silent room. It's not about knowing the latest frameworks or the trendiest programming languages. It's about understanding the fundamental principles that make complex systems work, and having the pattern recognition to identify problems that less experienced developers miss. I gestured toward the code still displayed on the screen. Jake's connection pool theory wasn't necessarily wrong, it was incomplete. He saw symptoms and jumped to conclusions based on limited experience with large-scale systems. There's nothing wrong with that. It's part of the learning process. But when someone with more experience suggests a different approach, maybe the response should be curiosity rather than dismissal. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and I could see people around the table processing not just the technical demonstration they'd witnessed, but the broader implications of what I was saying about expertise, respect, and the value of experience in a youth-obsessed industry. Mark cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. Well, yes, obviously we value your input, Angela. That's why we're here having this discussion. No, I said, my voice still calm but carrying an edge of steel that made several people sit up straighter in their chairs. We're here having this discussion because the client is threatening to cancel a $2 million contract. If everything were working fine, my input would continue to be dismissed, minimized, and credited to other people. The accusation was out in the open now, no longer hidden beneath layers of professional courtesy and workplace politeness. Around the table, I could see people shifting uncomfortably as they recognized the truth in what I was saying, remembering instances where they'd witnessed or participated in the pattern I was describing. Tanya was nodding slightly, her expression a mixture of admiration and something that looked like relief that someone had finally said what needed to be said. Jake looked mortified, perhaps realizing for the first time how his own advancement had come at the expense of recognizing others' contributions. Sarah Chen was studying Mark's face with obvious interest, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. And Mark himself. Mark looked like a man who'd just realized he'd been playing chess with someone he'd assumed was still learning checkers. The demonstration was over, but the real reckoning was just beginning. The aftermath of my technical demonstration settled over the conference room like dust after an explosion. 23 people sat in various states of shock, processing what they'd just witnessed and trying to reconcile it with their preconceptions about who I was and what I was capable of. The silence stretched for nearly a full minute in eternity in a business meeting before. Mark cleared his throat and attempted to regain control of the situation. Well, he said, his voice carefully modulated to project authority. He clearly no longer felt, this has been ... educational. Angela, we'll definitely want to implement your solution, and we'll need to discuss the deployment timeline with the client. It was a masterclass in corporate deflection, acknowledging my contribution while simultaneously diminishing its significance and avoiding any direct admission that his judgment had been catastrophically wrong. But I'd been in tech long enough to recognize the maneuver, and I was no longer in the mood to let it slide. Mark, I said, remaining seated while he shuffled papers with artificial urgency, I think we need to talk about more than just deployment timelines. He looked up from his papers with the expression of someone hoping an uncomfortable situation would resolve itself through willful ignorance. What do you mean? I mean, we need to talk about how a critical system flaw went undetected for months while your best people were working on it. We need to talk about how a problem that threatened your biggest client relationship was solved in 11 minutes by someone whose expertise you've been questioning since the day I started here. The room's energy shifted palpably, as people realized this wasn't going to be a polite wrap-up to an unusual meeting. This was going to be a conversation about things that usually remained unspoken in professional environments, about bias, assumptions, and the invisible hierarchies that determined whose voices were heard and whose were ignored. Jake finally found his voice, though it came out smaller than his usual confident tone. Angela, I want to apologize. You were right about the authentication system, and I should have listened when you tried to explain the race condition issue. I turned to look at him directly, seeing for the first time not the cocky young developer who'd been positioned as my technical superior, but a person genuinely grappling with his own limitations. There was real remorse in his expression, and I found myself feeling something unexpected, not satisfaction at his discomfort, but a kind of maternal protectiveness for someone who was learning a difficult lesson about humility and respect. Jake, I said gently, your apology is appreciated, but this isn't really about you. You're a talented developer who made a reasonable mistake based on limited experience. That's normal, and it's how people learn. I stood up and walked to the whiteboard at the front of the room, picking up a marker and turning to face the assembled group. This is about patterns. This is about systems, not computer systems, human systems that determine how decisions get made, how expertise gets recognized, and how value gets attributed in organizations like this one. On the whiteboard, I drew a simple diagram, a circle representing the core decision-making group, with several smaller circles positioned outside it. In every organization, there's an inner circle where the real work gets discussed, where problems get solved, and where credit gets distributed. And then there are the satellites people who do important work, but somehow aren't part of the core conversations. I labeled the inner circle the team and pointed to one of the satellite circles. Guess where I've been positioned since I started working here? The question was rhetorical, but I could see people around the table making the connection. Tanya was nodding with obvious recognition. Sarah Chen was taking notes with renewed intensity, and several of the project managers were looking uncomfortable as they remembered meetings where I'd been excluded or overlooked. Now, here's the interesting part, I continued, drawing arrows from the satellite circles toward the center. When people in the satellites try to contribute, their input gets filtered through assumptions about their competence, their relevance, their ability to understand modern approaches to problems they've been solving longer than some of you have been alive. Mark was shifting in his chair, clearly wanting to interrupt but uncertain how to do so without making the situation worse. His usual confidence had evaporated, replaced by the uncomfortable awareness that he was being held accountable for patterns he'd probably never consciously examined. Angela, he said finally, I think you're reading too much into normal workplace dynamics. Everyone here is respected for their contributions. The statement was so divorced from reality that it took me a moment to formulate a response. Mark, in the 18 months I've worked here, how many of my technical recommendations have been implemented? He paused, clearly trying to remember instances that would support his claim of respect and inclusion. The pause stretched long enough to become answer itself. I'm sure there have been several. There have been 0. I said simply. 0 recommendations implemented, despite the fact that I've identified security vulnerabilities, performance optimization, and architectural improvements that could have prevented problems like the one we just solved. The specificity of my statement landed like a physical blow. Around the table, people were doing their own mental calculations, remembering meetings where my contributions had been dismissed or credited to others, times when my warnings about technical issues had been ignored until they became crises. What about the database optimization project last quarter? Asked Marcus Williams, genuinely trying to remember an instance where my input had been valued. I proposed a comprehensive indexing strategy that would have improved query performance by 40%, I replied. My recommendation was to implement it during the scheduled maintenance window. Instead, you went with Jake's suggestion to upgrade to a faster server, which cost $20,000 and improved performance by 8%. Jake winced at the comparison, and I could see him doing the math on return on investment versus actual results. My solution would have been essentially free and 5 times more effective, but it had been dismissed in favor of an approach that felt more innovative and modern. The client dashboard redesign, tried Sarah Chen. I identified usability. The aftermath of my technical demonstration settled over the conference room like dust after an explosion. 23 people sat in various states of shock, processing what they'd just witnessed and trying to reconcile it with their preconceptions about who I was and what I was capable of. The silence stretched for nearly a full minute in eternity in a business meeting before. Mark cleared his throat and attempted to regain control of the situation. Well, he said, his voice carefully modulated to project authority. He clearly no longer felt. This has been educational. Angela, we'll definitely want to implement your solution, and we'll need to discuss the deployment timeline with the client. It was a masterclass in corporate deflection, acknowledging my contribution while simultaneously diminishing its significance and avoiding any direct admission that his judgment had been catastrophically wrong. But I'd been in tech long enough to recognize the maneuver, and I was no longer in the mood to let it slide. Mark, I said, remaining seated while he shuffled papers with artificial urgency, I think we need to talk about more than just deployment timelines. He looked up from his papers with the expression of someone hoping an uncomfortable situation would resolve itself through willful ignorance. What do you mean? I mean, we need to talk about how a critical system flaw went undetected for months while your best people were working on it. We need to talk about how a problem that threatened your biggest client relationship was solved in 11 minutes by someone whose expertise you've been questioning since the day I started here. The room's energy shifted palpably, as people realized this wasn't going to be a polite wrap-up to an unusual meeting. This was going to be a conversation about things that usually remained unspoken in professional environments, about bias, assumptions, and the invisible hierarchies that determined whose voices were heard and whose were ignored. Jake finally found his voice, though it came out smaller than his usual confident tone. Angela, I want to apologize. You were right about the authentication system, and I should have listened when you tried to explain the race condition issue. I turned to look at him directly, seeing for the first time not the cocky young developer who'd been positioned as my technical superior, but a person genuinely grappling with his own limitations. There was real remorse in his expression, and I found myself feeling something unexpected, not satisfaction at his discomfort, but a kind of maternal protectiveness for someone who was learning a difficult lesson about humility and respect. Jake, I said gently, your apology is appreciated. 2 weeks ago, I continued, when the client first reported authentication failures, I requested access to the production logs so I could analyze the problem. I was told that Jake was handling the investigation and that too many people looking at the same issue would create confusion. Mark's face had gone completely pale as he realized how the timeline of dismissal and crisis looked when laid out chronologically. Every decision to marginalize my input had directly contributed to the emergency they were now facing, and the pattern was too clear and consistent to be explained away as coincidence or normal workplace dynamics. So when you ask me to document my findings for review in team meetings, I said, returning to my seat and facing Mark directly, when you tell me that your best people are working on problems I identified months ago, when you suggest that my experience might not be relevant to modern systems, what you're really telling me is that my 30 years of expertise, my proven track record, my ability to identify and solve complex technical problems, all of that matters less than your assumptions about who belongs in your inner circle. The accusation hung in the air like smoke, acrid and undeniable. Mark opened his mouth as if to respond, then closed it again, apparently recognizing that anything he said would only make the situation worse. But I wasn't done. 30 years of accumulated frustration, 18 months of systematic dismissal, and the sweet satisfaction of having my expertise finally recognized had combined to create a moment of absolute clarity about what needed to be said. Here's what's going to happen next, I said, my voice carrying the authority that comes from being completely, unassailably right. I'm going to deploy the authentication fix, and it's going to resolve the Morrison Financial crisis completely. Their authentication failures will drop to zero, their user satisfaction will improve, and they'll probably renew their contract for another 2 years. I stood up again, gathering my materials with the deliberate precision I'd learned from watching my grandmother prepare to leave church after delivering a particularly pointed sermon. And when that happens, when my solution saves this company's biggest client relationship and prevents the revenue loss that would have required layoffs, I expect some changes in how my contributions are valued and integrated into this team's decision-making process. The room was completely silent as I walked toward the door, my footsteps echoing off the polished concrete floor. But before leaving, I turned back to face the assembled group one more time. Or, I said with a smile that didn't reach my eyes, I can take my 30 years of experience, my deep understanding of the systems you depend on, and my ability to solve problems your best people can't even properly diagnose, and I can take all of that somewhere else. Your choice. The door closed behind me with a soft click that somehow sounded like thunder. I didn't go back to my desk immediately after dropping that ultimatum in the conference room. Instead, I found myself walking through the corridors of Henderson Tech Solutions like I was seeing the place for the first time, really seeing it, not just navigating through it on my way to another day of being invisible. The exposed brick walls, that had seemed so trendy when I started, now looked like what they were, an attempt to make a sterile corporate environment feel authentic and creative. The motivational posters with their Silicon Valley mantras, move fast and break things, code is poetry, disrupt everything now, struck me as the desperate affirmations of people trying to convince themselves they were revolutionaries rather than just another tech company chasing profit margins. I ended up in the small kitchen area, making myself a cup of tea with the methodical precision that had become my meditation over the years. The routine was comforting. Water to exactly the right temperature. Tea bag steeped for exactly 4 minutes. 1 spoonful of honey, stirred clockwise until it dissolved completely. These small rituals of control mattered when so much of my professional life felt chaotic and unpredictable. Through the kitchen window, I could see downtown Chicago stretching toward the lake, the afternoon sun casting long shadows between buildings that contained thousands of people pursuing their own versions of success and fulfillment, somewhere in that urban landscape were companies that might actually value what I had to offer, organizations where my experience would be seen as an asset rather than an anachronism. The thought was both terrifying and liberating. At 52, starting over felt like an enormous risk, but staying felt like a slow death of spirit and self-respect. I'd spent 30 years building expertise that should have made me invaluable, but I was working in an environment where my value was constantly questioned and my contributions systematically marginalized. Angela. I turned to find Tanya standing in the kitchen doorway, her expression a mixture of admiration and concern that reminded me of students I'd mentored at previous young people trying to navigate industries that hadn't quite figured out how to be fair to everyone who wanted to contribute. That was incredible, she said, moving to the coffee machine and beginning her own afternoon ritual. I've never seen anything like what you did in there. The way you diagnosed the problem, wrote the solution and explained it so clearly it was like watching a masterclass in software engineering. Thank you, I said, genuinely touched by her enthusiasm. But I'm more interested in what you observed about the dynamics in that room. Tanya paused in measuring coffee, her face growing serious. You mean how everyone dismissed your expertise until you proved it so dramatically that they couldn't ignore it anymore? That's part of it, I agreed. What else did you notice? She was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking through the patterns she'd witnessed. Mark's face when he realized you were right about everything. Jake looking mortified that he'd been so confident about something he'd analyzed incorrectly. The way everyone suddenly started paying attention to what you were saying once they couldn't deny your competence anymore. And what does that tell you about how expertise gets recognized in environments like this? That it's not actually about expertise at all, she said quietly. It's about who fits the image of what expertise is supposed to look like. Jake fits that image, so his analysis was accepted without question, even when it was wrong. You don't fit the image, so your analysis was questioned even when it was right. The insight showed a level of awareness that gave me hope for the next generation. Tanya was learning to see the invisible systems that governed professional recognition and advanced that had shaped my entire career in ways both subtle and profound. I've been thinking about that timeline you drew on the whiteboard, she continued, pulling out her phone and showing me the photos she'd taken of my analysis. All those times you identified problems early, proposed solutions that would have prevented crises, warned about issues that later became emergencies. It's like watching someone predict the future and being ignored by people who can't see past their own assumptions. It's not predicting the future, I corrected gently. It's pattern recognition based on experience. When you've seen enough systems fail in similar ways, you start to recognize the warning signs before they become obvious to people with less experience. We stood in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both of us processing the implications of what had happened in that conference room. The demonstration hadn't just solved a technical problem, it had exposed fundamental issues with how this organization valued and utilized expertise. What are you going to do? Tanya asked finally. It was the question I'd been asking myself since I'd walked out of that meeting. The ultimatum I'd delivered wasn't just theater, it was a genuine choice point that would determine the trajectory of my remaining years in this industry. I'm going to implement the authentication fix, I said, because that's what's best for the client and for the users who depend on the system working correctly. But after that, I paused, considering how much of my internal struggle to share. After that, I need to decide whether this organization can actually change, or whether I need to find an environment where my experience is valued from the start, rather than having to be proven through crisis management. I hope you stay, Tanya said with obvious sincerity. I've learned more about system architecture and problem solving in the 18 months since you started here than I learned in my previous 3 years of experience. You've been teaching me things that aren't covered in any bootcamp or computer science program: how to think about systems holistically, how to anticipate failure modes, how to design solutions that are elegant and robust rather than just clever. Her words touched something deep in my chest, reminding me why I'd always enjoyed mentoring younger developers. There was something profoundly satisfying about passing on knowledge and perspective to people who were hungry to learn and grow. That means a lot to me, I told her, but I can't stay in a place where I have to prove my worth repeatedly while other people's competence is assumed based on demographics and image. I won't spend my remaining career years fighting for basic respect and recognition. What if things change? She asked. What if today was a turning point? It was an optimistic question that I wanted to believe in, but I'd seen too many instances of temporary awareness giving way to entrenched patterns once the immediate crisis passed. Change is possible, I said carefully, but it requires sustained commitment, not just temporary embarrassment. Real change would mean restructuring how decisions get made, how contributions get credited, how problems get analyzed. It would mean Mark acknowledging that his assumptions about expertise and value were fundamentally flawed, and that acknowledgement would need to translate into concrete changes in behavior and process. Through the kitchen window, I could see people moving around in the conference room where I'd delivered my demonstration. Mark was gesticulating animatedly, while Jake nodded with the subdued expression of someone whose confidence had been thoroughly shaken. Other team members were clustered in small groups, clearly discussing what they'd witnessed. They're still processing what happened, Tanya observed, following my gaze. The question is, what they'll do with that processing, I replied. Will they use this as an opportunity for genuine reflection about bias and inclusion, or will they find ways to minimize its significance so they can return to business as usual? My phone buzzed with a text message from Charles. How's your Tuesday going, sister? Anything interesting happening at the office? I smiled at the timing of his check-in. Charles had an uncanny ability to reach out exactly when I needed to hear from family. I typed back, just reminded some people who Angela Robinson actually is. We'll call you tonight with details. His response came immediately. That's my sister. Can't wait to hear the story. The unconditional support from Charles was exactly what I needed in this moment of uncertainty. Whatever happened with Henderson Tech Solutions, I had family who believed in me, a track record of success that spoke for itself, and the knowledge that I'd finally stopped accepting treatment that was beneath my qualifications and contributions. I should get back to my desk, I told Tanya. If I'm going to implement this authentication fix, I want to get it done while the momentum from the demonstration is still fresh. Can I watch? She asked eagerly. I'd love to see how you deploy something this critical to production. Of course, I said, feeling a surge of the teaching satisfaction that had always been one of my favorite aspects of senior roles. But first, let me show you something. I pulled out my notebook and opened it to the detailed analysis I'd prepared of the authentication system. Pages of diagrams, code snippets, performance calculations, and architectural recommendations that represented hours of careful investigation and expertise that no one had bothered to review or value. This is what 3 decades of experience looks like when it's applied systematically to a complex problem, I said, showing her the thoroughness of my documentation. It's not magic or intuition. It's methodical analysis based on pattern recognition, deep technical knowledge, and the kind of comprehensive understanding that only comes from years of working with similar systems. Tanya studied the pages with obvious fascination, asking detailed questions about my analytical process and the reasoning behind specific recommendations. Her enthusiasm reminded me of my younger self, hungry for knowledge and eager to understand not just what to do, but why and how to think about complex problems. As we walked back toward my desk, I realized that regardless of what happened with Henderson Tech Solutions, today had been a victory. Not just the technical victory of solving an impossible problem, but the personal victory of finally refusing to accept invisibility and disrespect as the price of employment. For the first time in 18 months, I felt like myself, again, not the diminished version I'd been allowing this environment to create, but the full Angela Robinson who had built a successful career on the foundation of excellence, integrity, and refusal to let anyone define her value for her. The authentication fix would be deployed within the hour, but the real work, the work of deciding what came next, was just beginning. By 4:30 p.m., I had transformed my corner workstation into a command center that would have made NASA proud. 3 monitors displayed different aspects of the authentication system: live production logs, streaming in real time, staging environment, test results, and the deployment pipeline that would push my fix to the servers that handled millions of user authentication requests each day. Tanya had pulled up a chair beside me, her notebook open and pen ready, as she prepared to document every step of what she correctly recognized as a masterclass in critical system deployment. Word had apparently spread through the office about what had happened in the conference room, because I noticed several other developers finding excuses to walk past my workstation, glancing at my screens with barely concealed curiosity. The first rule of deploying fixes to critical systems, I explained to Tanya as my fingers flew across the keyboard, is that you never deploy just a fix. You deploy a fix, comprehensive tests to verify the fix works as expected, rollback procedures in case something goes wrong, and monitoring to confirm that the deployed solution actually resolves the problem without creating new ones. She was taking detailed notes, clearly recognizing that this wasn't just technical instruction but a philosophy of responsible software engineering that had been refined over decades of experience with high-speed deployments. Most developers focus on making their code work, I continued, pulling up the test suite I'd written alongside the authentication fix. But senior engineers focus on making their code fail safely. Every line of code I write includes consideration of what happens when that line fails, how the failure will be detected, and how the system will recover. The test suite was comprehensive. Unit tests that verified the race condition fixed under various timing scenarios, integration tests that confirmed the new authentication flow worked correctly with existing systems, load tests that ensured the performance impact was negligible, and security tests that verified the distributed locking mechanism couldn't be exploited by malicious actors. "This is incredible," Tanya said, studying the test coverage reports on my secondary monitor. "You've got tests for conditions that I wouldn't even have thought to consider." "That's because you haven't spent 30 years debugging production failures at 2 a.m., I replied with a smile. "Every edge case I'm testing represents a lesson learned from previous systems that failed in ways their original developers never anticipated." As we worked, I became aware of activity in the conference room behind us. Through the glass walls, I could see Mark in what appeared to be an intense conversation with several other senior staff members. Occasionally, one of them would glance in my direction, and I recognized the body language of people trying to figure out how to handle a situation that had spiraled beyond their control. At 4:45, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Morrison Financial's main number. Our troubled client calling with what was probably another complaint about authentication failures. "Angela Robinson," I answered, putting the call on speaker so Tanya could listen to what real client interaction sounded like when you actually understood the systems you were responsible for. "Ms. Robinson, this is David Chen, CTO at Morrison Financial." His voice carried the tension of someone dealing with a system crisis that was affecting thousands of users. "I understand you're the engineer who's been working on our authentication issues." "That's correct, Mr. Chen. I've identified the root cause of the problem, and I'm currently deploying a fix to your production environment. You should see authentication failure rates begin to drop within the next 30 minutes. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could almost hear him processing the confidence in my voice, different from the uncertainty and deflection he'd probably been getting from other members of our team. "Can you explain what was causing the failures?" he asked. "We've had 3 different technical explanations from your company in the past 2 weeks, none of which seemed to address what we were actually experiencing." I glanced at Tanya, who was watching this interaction with obvious fascination. This was another teaching moment: how to communicate complex technical issues to non-decision makers in ways that built confidence rather than confusion. "The failures were caused by a race condition in the token validation logic," I explained. "When multiple authentication requests for the same user arrived within a very short time window, about 50 milliseconds, the system would incorrectly reject legitimate authentication attempts as potential security threats. And this explains why we were seeing higher failure rates during peak usage periods." "Exactly. Peak usage increases the likelihood of concurrent authentication requests, which made the race condition more visible." The previous explanations about database connection issues were focusing on symptoms rather than causes. "How confident are you that this fix will resolve our issues?" It was a question that demanded honesty rather than corporate hedging. "Mr. Chen, I've been working with authentication systems for 30 years. I've seen this exact pattern before, and I know how to fix it permanently. Your authentication failure rates will drop to essentially 0 within the next hour." The confidence in my voice seemed to reassure him, because his tone shifted from tense frustration to something approaching relief. "That's the most definitive answer we've gotten since this problem started." "When will the fix be fully deployed?" I checked the deployment pipeline status on my third monitor. "The fix is currently running through our automated testing pipeline, assuming all tests pass, and I'm confident they will. The deployment will begin in approximately 15 minutes and be complete within 30 minutes after that." And if something goes wrong during deployment, I've prepared comprehensive rollback procedures that can restore the previous system state within 5 minutes, I assured him, but I don't expect them to be necessary. This fix addresses the root cause of your issues without modifying any other system components. After a few more technical questions, all of which I answered, with the kind of specific detail that only comes from deep understanding, Mr. Chen thanked me and asked to be notified. As soon as the deployment was complete, that, I told Tanya after ending the call, is what client confidence sounds like when you actually know how to solve their problems. She was staring at me with something approaching. Oh, the way you explained that race condition, you made it sound so logical and straightforward. But I know it's actually an incredibly complex issue. Complexity is just a lack of proper abstraction, I replied, pulling up the deployment logs as my fix began its journey to production servers. Every complex problem can be broken down into simpler components if you understand the underlying patterns and relationships. At 5:15 p.m., the deployment completed successfully. Within minutes, the authentication failure monitoring dashboard began showing the results, error rates dropping from 12% to less than 1%. Then continuing to decline as the system processed authentic user requests without the race condition. Interference. Look at that, Tanya breathed, watching the real-time metrics transform before our eyes. It's actually working exactly like you predicted. Not predicted, I corrected gently. Engineered. When you understand the root cause of a problem and design a solution that addresses that specific cause, the results are predictable because they're based on solid technical foundations, rather than guesswork. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Ms. Robinson, this is David Chen. Authentication failures have dropped to 0 on our system. Thank you for actually solving our problem. Morrison Financial CTO. I showed the message to Tanya, who literally clapped her hands together in excitement. Angela, this is amazing. You just saved the company's biggest client relationship. The satisfaction was profound, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this moment of triumph existed within a larger context of systemic undervaluation and marginalization. I'd proven my expertise beyond any possible doubt. But the question remained, what would Henderson Tech Solutions do with this proof? As if summoned by my thoughts, Mark appeared at my workstation, his expression carefully composed but unable to hide the underlying tension. Behind him, I could see Jake hovering uncertainly, clearly wanting to approach but uncertain about his reception after the afternoon's revelations. Angela, Mark said, his voice carrying a forced casualness that fooled no one. I just got off the phone with Morrison Financial's CTO. He's very pleased with the results of your fix. I'm glad to hear it, I replied neutrally, continuing to monitor the deployment metrics. Without giving him my full attention, he specifically mentioned that you gave him the most confident and comprehensive technical explanation they've received since the problems began, Mark continued, clearly struggling to find the right tone for this conversation. That's what happens when you actually understand the systems you're responsible for, I said, finally turning to face him directly. The comment hit its mark, and I saw him flinch slightly before recovering his composure. Look, Angela, I think we need to talk about this afternoon's meeting, about some of the things that were said. Which things specifically? I asked, though I was fairly certain I knew where this conversation was heading. Mark glanced around at the other people within earshot, Tanya, Jake, and several other developers who had found reasons to linger near my workstation, clearly uncomfortable with having this conversation in public but uncertain how to move it to a more private setting without seeming to admit that privacy was necessary. Maybe we could discuss this in my office, he suggested. I think here is fine, I replied calmly. After all, this afternoon's meeting was public, and the patterns we discussed affect the entire team. Seems appropriate to have the follow-up conversation where everyone can hear it too. Jake finally found the courage to step forward. Angela, I owe you an apology, a real one, not just for being wrong about the technical analysis, but for not listening when you tried to share your expertise, for not recognizing what you brought to the team. It was a more genuine apology than I'd expected from him, and I could see the discomfort in his posture that suggested he was genuinely grappling with some difficult realizations about his own behavior and assumptions. I appreciate that, Jake, I said, and I want you to know that this was never personal. You're a talented developer with a lot of potential, but talent without humility becomes arrogance, and arrogance makes it impossible to learn from people who have different perspectives or more experience. He nodded. clearly taking the feedback seriously. How do I get better at recognizing when I'm missing something important? It was the right question, asked with genuine curiosity rather than defensiveness. Start by assuming that every person you work with knows something you don't, I suggested. When someone with more experience suggests a different approach, instead of immediately thinking of reasons why they might be wrong, start by trying to understand what they're seeing that you might be missing. That's exactly what I should have done with the authentication analysis, he said quietly. Instead of dismissing your race condition theory, I should have asked you to walk me through your reasoning. Now you're learning, I said with approval that was completely genuine. Jake's willingness to examine his own assumptions and learn from the afternoon's revelations suggested he had the potential to become not just a better developer, but a better colleague. Mark, however, was looking increasingly uncomfortable with the direction this conversation was taking. This is all very constructive, he said, but I think the important thing is that we resolved the client issue and we can move forward as a stronger team. The attempt to wrap up the conversation with corporate pleasantries was so transparent that I almost laughed. Move forward? How, exactly? Well, obviously your technical contributions are valued, and we want to make sure you feel included in future problem-solving discussions. Mark, I said, leaning back in my chair and studying his face with the clinical precision I usually reserved for debugging code. Do you understand what actually happened this afternoon? Of course, you solved a critical technical problem that we'd been struggling with, and we're grateful for your expertise. That's what happened on the surface, I agreed. But what happened underneath is that every assumption you've made about my competence, my relevance, and my value to this organization was proven completely wrong in front of the entire development team. Mark's expression shifted from forced pleasantness to something approaching defensiveness. I don't think that's entirely fair, Angela. I've always recognized your experience. No, I said firmly. You've always acknowledged my experience while simultaneously discounting its relevance to current work. There's a significant difference. I gestured toward my monitors, which still showed the successful deployment metrics and the Morrison Financial success story playing out in real. This afternoon, I didn't just solve a technical problem. I demonstrated that 30 years of experience translates into pattern recognition, architectural understanding, and problem-solving capabilities that your modern approach couldn't match. Tanya was taking notes again, clearly recognizing this as another teaching moment about professional dynamics and workplace equity. Jake was listening with the focused attention of someone trying to understand lessons that weren't part of any technical curriculum. But more importantly, I continued, I demonstrated that the system of assumptions and biases that has governed how my contributions are evaluated in this organization is not only unfair, it's counterproductive. It nearly cost you your biggest client. Mark's face was cycling through emotions as he processed what I was saying. I could see him struggling with the cognitive dissonance of having to reconcile his long-held assumptions with undeniable evidence that those assumptions were wrong. So when you talk about moving forward as a stronger team, I said, I need to know what that actually means in concrete terms. Does it mean my technical recommendations will be seriously evaluated instead of dismissed? Does it mean I'll be included in architectural decisions from the beginning instead of being brought in to clean up crises after they develop? Does it mean my contributions will be credited appropriately instead of being minimized or attributed to other people? The questions hung in the air like a test that Mark wasn't prepared to take. Around my workstation, several people had stopped pretending to work on other things and were openly listening to this conversation, clearly recognizing its significance for the broader culture of the organization. We can definitely work on improving communication and collaboration, Mark said finally. His answer so vague as to be meaningless. That's not an answer, I replied. That's corporate speak for let's hope this issue goes away without requiring any actual changes to how we operate. The directness of my challenge seemed to shock him. In his world, problems were supposed to be resolved through diplomatic language and face-saving compromises, not through direct confrontation with uncomfortable truths. What do you want me to say, Angela? I want you to say whether you're capable of fundamentally changing how expertise gets recognized and valued in this organization, or whether this afternoon's demonstration will be treated as an anomaly that doesn't require any systematic changes to your decision-making processes. It was the ultimate test not just of Mark's intentions, but of his capacity for the kind of honest self-examination that real organizational change required, and based on the expression on his face, I was beginning to suspect I already knew what his answer would be. But before he could respond, my phone rang again. Morrison Financial, probably calling to confirm that their authentication issues were completely resolved. "Excuse me," I said, answering the call while maintaining eye contact with Angela Robinson. "Ms. Robinson, this is David Chen again. I wanted to follow up on the authentication fix and discuss a potential expansion of our contract with Henderson Tech Solutions." The conversation that followed would change everything, not just for me, but for everyone who had witnessed this afternoon's demonstration of what happened when expertise was finally allowed to speak for itself. "Ms. Robinson," David Chen's voice carried an excitement that I hadn't heard in our previous conversations. "I've been monitoring our authentication systems for the past 2 hours, and the results are extraordinary. 0 failures, improved response times, and our user satisfaction scores have already begun to climb." I could see Mark's expression shifting as he realized this wasn't just a routine follow-up call, but potentially a conversation that would have significant implications for the company's future relationship with their biggest client. "I'm pleased that the fix is working as expected, Mr. Chen," I replied, keeping my voice professional while watching Mark's growing discomfort with obvious satisfaction. "More than working as expected," he continued. "Ms. Robinson, in my 15 years as a CTO, I've rarely encountered an engineer who could diagnose a complex system problem so quickly and implement such an elegant solution. Your technical analysis was exactly what we needed, and your communication throughout the process was exemplary." Tanya was grinning broadly, clearly enjoying watching me receive the recognition I'd been denied for months. Jake was taking notes, apparently recognizing this as a masterclass in client relationship management as well as technical problem solving, which brings me to the reason for my call. Mr. Chen continued. "Morrison Financial is considering a significant expansion of our technology infrastructure over the next 2 years. We're looking at projects involving payment processing systems, fraud detection algorithms, and advanced authentication protocols, exactly the kind of complex, high-stakes work that requires the depth of experience you demonstrated today." Mark's eyes widened as he began to understand the implications. Morrison Financial wasn't just keeping their existing contract, they were potentially tripling or quadrupling it based on their confidence in my abilities. "We'd like to structure the expanded contract around your direct involvement in the technical architecture and implementation," Mr. Chen said. "Would Henderson Tech Solutions be able to accommodate that level of client-specific engagement?" I looked directly at Mark as I responded. "Mr. Chen, that would depend on Henderson Tech's willingness to restructure how they utilize senior technical expertise. Could you give me 24 hours to discuss this internally and get back to you with a definitive answer?" "Of course, but Ms. Robinson, I want to be clear about something. Morrison Financial's expansion plans are contingent on having you as the lead technical architect. Your expertise and communication style have impressed our entire technical team. If Henderson Tech can't accommodate that level of engagement, we'll need to consider alternative vendors who can." The ultimatum was politely delivered but unmistakable. Mark's face had gone pale as he realized that his biggest client was essentially demanding that I be given the authority and recognition I'd been requesting for months. After ending the call, I leaned back in my chair and studied Mark's expression with the clinical detachment of someone who had just been handed extraordinary leverage in a negotiation she hadn't even realized she was having. "So," I said calmly, "it seems Morrison Financial would like to expand their contract, but only if I'm given direct authority over technical architecture and implementation. What do you think, Mark? Can Henderson Tech accommodate that level of client-specific engagement?" The room was completely silent as everyone processed what they'd just heard. A multi-million-dollar contract expansion, contingent on recognizing and utilizing expertise that had been systematically marginalized for months. Mark opened his mouth, closed it again, then seemed to realize that everyone was waiting for his response to what amounted to a corporate checkmate. "Angela," he said finally, his voice careful and measured, "obviously we want to accommodate our clients' preferences. Can we discuss the details of what this kind of engagement would look like?" "Certainly," I replied, pulling out my notebook and opening it to a page I'd prepared months earlier. A comprehensive proposal for how senior technical expertise should be integrated into the company's decision-making processes. I actually have some thoughts on that. The proposal I'd drafted included specific recommendations for technical leadership structure, decision-making processes that incorporated experience alongside innovation, mentorship programs that would transfer knowledge from senior engineers to junior developers, and client engagement protocols that leveraged deep expertise for complex problem-solving. I walked through each element of the proposal. I could see people around my workstation beginning to understand what organizational change might actually look like. Not just diversity initiatives or inclusion training, but fundamental restructuring of how technical decisions were made and how different types of expertise were valued and utilized. This is essentially a senior technical architect role, Mark said, reviewing my recommendations. It's a role that recognizes that 30 years of experience solving complex problems has value that can't be replicated by enthusiasm and familiarity with current frameworks. I corrected, it's a role that treats expertise as an asset rather than a liability. Jake spoke up from his position near my desk. Angela, if you took on this kind of role, would you be willing to work with junior developers like me to help us learn how to think about problems the way you do? The question revealed a maturity I hadn't expected from him, and I felt a surge of the mentoring instinct that had always been one of my favorite aspects of senior positions. Jake, that would be exactly the kind of work I'd want to do, I assured him. Teaching pattern recognition, architectural thinking, and systematic problem-solving approaches, that's how expertise gets multiplied rather than just applied to individual problems. What about compensation? Asked Mark, clearly trying to understand the full scope of what I was proposing. Market rate for a senior technical architect with 3 decades of experience, I replied without hesitation, plus equity participation that reflects the value I'll be creating for the company through client retention and expansion. The financial implications were clearly significant, but Mark was smart enough to understand that losing Morrison Financial would cost far more than paying appropriate compensation for the expertise that would keep them engaged. I'll need to discuss this with the executive team, he said, but based on the client feedback and the demonstration of capability we saw today, I think we can work something out. Mark, I said, standing up from my chair and gathering my materials with the same deliberate precision I'd used when leaving the conference room earlier. I want to be clear about something. This isn't a negotiation where you hold all the cards and I'm hoping for concessions. I gestured toward my monitors, which still showed the successful authentication fix and the metrics proving its effectiveness. I've just demonstrated that my expertise can solve critical problems that stumped your entire development team. I've received direct client feedback that makes it clear my value to this organization is substantial and quantifiable. And I have 30 years of experience that makes me highly marketable to competitors who might be more eager to utilize what I bring to the table. The room was silent as everyone processed what amounted to a polite but firm statement of my leverage in this situation. So, when I ask for structural changes that ensure my contributions are valued and my expertise is utilized effectively, I continued, I'm not asking for favors. I'm defining the conditions under which I'm willing to continue contributing to this organization's success. Mark nodded slowly, clearly understanding that the power dynamic between us had shifted permanently. What's your timeline for a decision? Morrison Financial wants an answer within 24 hours about my involvement in their expanded contract. I replied, I'll give Henderson Tech the same timeline to decide whether you want to restructure how you utilize senior technical expertise, or whether I should start exploring opportunities with organizations that already understand its value. I started walking toward the elevator, then turned back to address the room one more time. For those of you who witnessed what happened today, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the open workspace, I want you to understand that this was never just about authentication systems or race conditions or even client relationships. This was about the right of every person in this industry to have their contributions evaluated based on merit rather than assumptions about who looks like they belong in technical leadership roles. I looked directly at Tanya, who was watching me with obvious admiration. The next generation of developers, people like Tanya, shouldn't have to spend decades proving their worth to people who can't see past their own biases about age, gender, race, or any other characteristic that has nothing to do with technical competence. The elevator doors opened, and I stepped inside, but I held them open long enough to deliver one final thought. Change is possible, I said. but only when the cost of maintaining broken systems becomes higher than the cost of fixing them. Today, Henderson Tech Solutions gets to decide which cost they're willing to pay. As the elevator descended toward the parking garage, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: the profound satisfaction of being seen, valued, and respected for exactly who I was and what I brought to the table. My phone buzzed with a text from Charles. "How did the rest of your Tuesday go, sister?" I smiled as I typed my response. "Let's just say Angela Robinson is back, and people are finally paying attention." Whether I stayed at Henderson Tech Solutions or moved on to an organization that valued expertise from the beginning, one thing was certain: I was done accepting invisibility as the price of employment. At 52, with 30 years of experience and a newly rediscovered sense of my own worth, I was ready to write the next chapter of my story on my own terms. The code I'd written that afternoon would keep running on servers around the world, processing millions of authentication requests with elegant efficiency. But the real program I'd launched was something else entirely: a systematic process for demanding the respect and recognition that expertise deserved, regardless of who possessed it or what they looked like. And that code, I knew, was going to change everything.